Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel. I think it's the last panel of the day on accelerating adoption of renewable energy. So at BNEF, we've been tracking renewables for somewhere around 15 years. We've seen enormous growth just from megawatt scale up to more than 200 gigawatts of renewables being installed every year at the moment. And we've seen the economics transform so that renewables are now the cheapest source of electricity in many parts of the world, and policymakers beginning to really understand that and put in place mechanisms to drive adoption. But at the same time, we need much more. According to our New Energy Outlook, we need to quintuple wind deployments and triple solar deployments and maintain that level for the rest of this decade to get on track for Paris and net zero by 2050. So there's a lot of work to do. And I'm delighted to be talking to Ralph and Amanda, who you can share, I think, some really deep experiences and perspectives on how we're going to rise to that challenge. So welcome to the Bloomberg Green Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd first like to ask you both, is renewable energy boring now? I mean, so we've had this amazing two-day summit. We've talked about carbon offsets, about innovation and technology in cities and everything. And here we are at the end of day two talking about renewables. Are we taking renewables for granted? Has it become boring?
Yes, well, I'll go ahead and give my perspective. I mean, the fact that you're even asking that question is emblematic of just how far we've come over the last decade, right? When I think about 2009 in California, right, solar was just starting to become commercialized, and look at where we are today. But as you pointed out and what you just said, we're still going to need large volumes, right? To get to net zero by 2050, IEA is saying we need 3 to 4 times. So while it may be boring, and that's a good thing, right, we're still going to need to scale, and we're going to need a lot more of it. But yes, I think, as I think about my own personal conversations that I've had both here and over the past year, the conversations are really turning to next generation technologies and new technologies, right? We're going to continue to deploy more wind and solar, but the conversations are really changing in the industry.
Ralph?
I don't think it's a sign of anything other than a maturation
Yeah.
of the whole dialogue. There was some great news coming out of Saudi Arabia about 1.04 cents per kWh for solar farms. But we're beginning to realize that, well, wow, we need to focus our attention on the problem. The problem is greenhouse gases. And let's not jump to the one, albeit very important solution, i.e. renewables. Let's talk about offsets. Let's talk about nuclear. Let's talk about energy efficiency. So I don't think renewables have gotten boring. They're on a trajectory. People are comfortable with that trajectory, and they realize that the magnitude of the issue demands attention to some other tools that might be in the toolkit.
So both of you are US-based. I do want to spend a bit of time on the US policy landscape because there's a huge amount of focus right now, a lot of attention on Washington. Now the US, I think for those of you who don't know, has had a lot of success deploying renewables through systems of tax credits and renewable portfolio standards. We now have an infrastructure bill that's going to promote grid investment and storage. We don't yet have an economic stimulus bill that contains more tax credits. I'm just keen to hear your reflections on, are these packages the right packages that the US needs? Are the right things in there? Are there things missing that we wish we could have in these big legislative packages?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I learned a long time ago, Albert, to not let perfection become the enemy of the good. So what I'd say is that what's in the Build Back Better plan, the one that you referred to, is phenomenally important. Production tax credits for renewables, continuing those. There's also a little known provision in there that is essential for preservation of 50% of the nation's carbon-free electricity today, which is a production tax credit for existing nuclear plants. Again, if we want to get stronger, if we want to have further reductions, we shouldn't give up the progress that we've made. So I think that there's much to speak well of in the current Build Back Better. My one preference, if somebody would allow me an opportunity to seek perfection as opposed to just what's good enough, it would be an economy-wide price on carbon. Because the focus on electricity, while merited, it has now led to electricity being the #2 source of carbon emissions in America, with transportation #1. But both of those basically amounting to a little over 2/3 of the emissions. So you've got a whole third of other opportunities to look at. So I think tax credits with a economy-wide price on carbon would really catapult us forward in terms of our development of technologies and carbon reductions.
Amanda?
Yeah, I would say we're absolutely happy to see the bipartisan passage of the infrastructure bill, and you know, there's a lot in there, and it's a lot needed in the U.S. in particular. One thing we were happy to see is there's $30 billion for demonstration projects. So as I mentioned, it's going to take more than wind and solar, and so looking at how we develop these new technologies. We're also supportive of the Buy Back Better Act, and as Ralph mentioned, we created a marketplace that's operating really well with the ITC and the PTC extension for wind and solar. It's developed, it's established, let's keep it going. And I think what that bill really got right was including, as you mentioned, other technologies, right, to expand it beyond, to keep nuclear that isn't at the end of its life online, and to think about other things, carbon capture, et cetera, et cetera. So. And then one little known thing in the bill that we're excited about as well is thinking about market reform and regional grids in parts of the country that we could see better interconnection within our system, and how those market works for end users like us. We heard John Kerry talk about that this morning, right? We can't get an electron from California to New York. And so that's part of the bill act as well that we're happy to see.
Yeah, and looking slightly longer term, there's an ambition to get to 80% clean power in the US by 2030, so that's 9 years from now. What is it now? It's probably about 40% carbon-free power in the US?
That's if you include nuclear and hydro, yes.
Yeah, about 40%. So we need to roughly double that. What's that going to take? I mean, what else do we need to be thinking about to get to that sort of penetration so quickly?
Well, please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think you really need an economy-wide price signal, because it may make more sense for some agricultural practice modification, some industrial process modification, some building efficiency to be the wiser thing to do than blank, whether that blank is a rooftop solar system or an offshore wind system. The issue has been the waxing and waning of policy direction in the United States. What's been so phenomenally important about COP has been, I am now 100% convinced that the policy arrow globally is in one direction. We may quarrel over the pace at which we will take that direction upon ourselves, but businesses aren't waiting for government anymore. I mean, Alphabet has done a phenomenal job of making pledges about when they're going to get to net zero. We've done the same thing. But the confusion that gets created by this hodgepodge of solutions really stifles investment and innovation. I ask people this absurd little pop quiz, and I make fun of my own home state of New Jersey, although I admonish people that I'm sure that if I knew something about your geography, I could do the same. And I ask people, how much is it worth the New Jersey economy to avoid the emissions of 1 ton of carbon? Is it worth $400? Is it worth $100? Is it worth $17? Or is it worth negative $125? And the snarkiness results from the fact that I don't give you the right answer. The right answer is all the above. Well, how can it be worth $400 per ton at the same time it's worth negative $125 per ton? And that's because we don't have a visible price. Instead, we pick and choose technologies that we think will work. And the negative 125, for the folks who are interested, is the one that gets the least attention, and that's energy efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, as we already talked about, we need to scale and we need to do it faster, right? Yeah. From a private sector point of view, right, it's, and Ralph touched on it, it's clarity in policy, clarity in law, clarity in regulation, so that, again, we're talking about long-lived assets here. So I need to know today if I make an investment or I buy an offtake that the rules aren't going to change next year. And we're seeing that in different parts of the world actively, and it makes dollars on the sidelines skittish to get involved or to buy offtake because they need to understand the risk. But I think also, and prior to Google, I was a developer, I was an investor, so I've played in all parts of the value chain, and the problems remain the same, at least in the US, right, of the interconnection queue and having real projects and the timing and the cost and how cost is allocated. A clarity in permitting and how these projects can get done, land cost, supply chain issues. Anything that adds ambiguity into the process slows down scale and commercial adoption at scale. And so those are the things that we think about in working with our partners to develop the infrastructure we need, right?
Yeah, for sure. Grid development and supply chains, as you say, completely critical. Ralph, can we talk a little bit about New Jersey in particular? I mean, I think energy transition is global, but it's also always very local. So maybe if you could share just a bit of the particular opportunities and challenges that you've faced or that you are facing in the transition in New Jersey.
Yeah, we're trying to take a three-phased approach to the issue. Phase number one is to make sure that we're using as little energy as we need to meet the needs of the economy and lifestyle. The other quiz I ask people is, and I can't see perfectly well with these lights on, but how many folks woke up this morning and said, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour? Right, that's the honest reaction that I always get. So we begin with energy efficiency. We say, let's make sure that our energy consumption per dollar of GDP and our dollars of GDP per capita are optimized. Then we say, okay, now that we've done that, let's see if we can maximize the amount of, minimize the amount of carbon that we're emitting. And that means lose no ground. So in New Jersey, 90% of our carbon-free energy is nuclear. 40% of our energy is nuclear. So we want to keep those plants alive. And there are imperfections in the competitive market in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast United States that puts those plants at risk. After that, we say, let's increase the supply of carbon-free energy. For New Jersey, that means offshore wind. We've spent a lot of time and money on rooftop solar. It is extremely expensive. It's what costs $400 per ton of carbon avoided. But we're seeing the supply chain develop for offshore wind and the price for offshore wind come down rather precipitously. The state has an ambition to develop 7.5 gigawatts, which will produce about 30 terawatt hours of electricity, which is about 40% of New Jersey's electricity demand, albeit not dispatchable. And then we have to turn our attention to the number one source of carbon emissions in this state, and that's transportation. So we're number 6 in the nation in electric vehicle penetration. We have a $200 million infrastructure build-out program to get over range phobia. But there's this chicken and egg issue about, well, if you don't buy the cars, we're not going to build the infrastructure. If you don't build the infrastructure, we're not going to buy the cars, but hopefully we'll make progress. So it's use less, use cleaner. And then sadly, because we've been slow to act, a critical part is adaptation. And we've invested billions of dollars in strengthening the grid. And our two endpoints that we can point to in terms of success is that back in 2012, we had a major event called Superstorm Sandy, where 1.8 million out of our 2 million customers lost power. We've spent the ensuing decade hardening the grid, and we recently had something called Tropical Storm Ida, which had a very similar flooding footprint, and we only lost 5% of our customers. So it really is use less, use cleaner, and make the grid more resilient, because in the future, we'll be charging our vehicles, charging our phones, charging our computers, and doing a whole bunch of different things.
Can I follow up on the point about offshore wind in particular?
Sure.
I mean, we're very excited about the opportunities for offshore wind globally and in the US. We see huge growth potential. I know PSEG has made one major investment this year. Right. Do you see the company playing a bigger role in that beyond New Jersey, or how, where do you see the future role for PSEG?
So a qualified yes, certainly beyond New Jersey, but not as big a role as I wish we would have played. And it's an important issue as it relates to COP. One of the common arguments you hear in policy circles in Washington against being too aggressive is that, well, what good does it do if nation A, B, and C don't do the same? And you know who A and B are, certainly, if not C. And my argument against that is, we decided about 10 years ago in New Jersey to invest in offshore wind, and then we stopped. And there was a change in administration, and now we have an administration that's eager to invest in offshore wind, and we're not alone. Multiple states are investing in offshore wind to the tune of 30 gigawatts. But look at who the dominant players are. Yes, we're making a major investment. We own 25% of a project that Ørsted is developing because they're the world leader. A competitor of ours, First Energy, is making a major investment with Royal Dutch Shell. Iberdrola is there with Avangrid. So the leading offshore wind companies are European companies. Why? Do they have better engineers than us? With all due respect, no. But they've been at it for 10 years. So they know how to do it. So this notion that we should wait for others to lead, I think, is a massive mistake. We ought to be the ones developing advanced batteries, advanced nuclear fuel cycles, small modular reactors, higher efficiency solar, better materials for larger wind turbines, so that we can become the major exporter, if you believe, as I do, that the arrow is pointing in one direction. I believe that by the end of the Governor Murphy's second administration, we will have commitments to build 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. Whether or not one U.S. company is the primary developer, I am doubtful.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting, and look forward to seeing how that plays out. Amanda, a big part of your role is actually buying renewables, and in the US, that's actually quite a mature activity that you can do through systems of PPAs and things like that, and Google has been a major leader in that. Outside of the US, it's a bit more complicated. It may not be that straightforward to go to the market. So how are you operating in other markets? How are you squaring that circle?
Yep. No, so we are a global company and we have a global footprint, and our 24/7 carbon-free initiative, which we may talk about, is really starting to look at going beyond 100% renewable, which is matching on an annual basis anywhere in the world, to focusing regionally and hourly to always procure carbon-free energy. And so that requires us to think about the harder grids and think about our grids globally. And I think this is really where policy and thinking about market reform is extremely important, right? And our hardest markets are generally in Asia, which is many island nations with a lot of LNG import economies, right? Without a lot of naturally occurring wind and solar, or the land to support it, so these are ones that are going to require different technologies and different solutions to solve the problem. But really important, sorry, I jumped around, but to talk about market reform, in Taiwan, for example, where we have a location that a lot of suppliers and technology suppliers are based, until recently, as an end user buyer, you couldn't go to the utility and get any form of renewable or carbon-free energy. You couldn't request it. But we worked with the government there over a number of years, and in 2017, they amended their Electricity Act to allow for direct wheeling of renewables to end users and to work within the system to do that. And that was a lot of work and a lot of collaboration, but shortly thereafter that, we immediately signed our first corporate power purchase agreement, the first one in Taiwan. But more importantly, and I was having a conversation at the lunch table today about this, it's not just about us, right? Because Google alone can't solve this, right? It changed the Electricity Act so others could do it too. And very shortly thereafter, TSMC signed the largest corporate power purchase agreement of 920 megawatts of offshore wind. So it opened up the market for end users to really transact in that market. And so when we look at other places in the world, each one has its own regulatory system and own market structure, and we have to figure out, is there an opportunity, and what's the best way for us as end users to work within that and change that if we need to.
And that's great, and I think that's a good example of how supply chains that are trying to green themselves can actually promote forward progress on market design, on policy in different markets. Let's go back to 24/7 clean energy, and you mentioned a bit about kind of some new technologies. What technologies are you excited about, or what are you looking at there?
Yeah, and so, and even tying that back to the question you asked before, the technologies, like we already talked about, we're going to need a lot more wind and solar. That's a given. We're going to keep doing that, and we're going to do it where it makes sense and it's economically viable. But depending on where you are in the world, you're going to need a different technology to solve the problem, right? It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, right? So we're looking at a whole bunch of technologies. Many of them we've heard discussed here and at COP in general, whether that's short duration, long duration storage, carbon sequestration, capture and sequestration, green hydrogen, and then even this year we did the first corporate offtake with an advanced geothermal extraction company looking at new methods, and this is in the US and Nevada, and this is really interesting because the same technology that was developed in the shale gas era, right, is now being used to access pockets of geothermal technology that you couldn't get to before. So it's really repurposing that in a way that we can get carbon-free generation, right, and really promoting that. But again, the solution for one specific technology in one part of the world may not make sense in another, so we are looking at all of it, right, and being very technology inclusive in how we think about that.
Great. Coming back to you, Ralph, your company has set a 2030 net zero target. I think it was pulled forward, right? It was
2046 and we pulled it forward.
And pulled it forward. Now, I think the skeptics will say, and I'm an analyst, so I have to be skeptical,
That's fine.
that you're doing that by selling your fossil portfolio and hanging on to your nuclear. and that won't actually solve the net zero challenge for the power system in New Jersey. So what's your thought? What's your thinking on
No, there's a large element of truth to that, and we're not shy about admitting to it. So right now, our Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, 1 and 2 are about 50% of our emissions. Scope 3 is about 50% of our emissions. We've done a lot of things that do help the planet with respect to the dominant part of Scope 1 and Scope 2, which are our power plant emissions. We shut our 2 coal plants in New Jersey. We shut our coal plant in Connecticut. We shut 2,500 megawatts of what are called high energy delivery day peaking units, which were a combination of oil and natural gas. So all of that stuff helped the planet. But to your point, we have probably the most efficient natural gas fleet in the nation at an average heat rate of 7,200 BTUs per kWh. And while we wanted to get out of that business, it would have been a shareholder travesty if we'd simply shut them down. So we sold that. So that won't help the planet, but it does help our signature. Once that transaction closes, which will be sometime early in Q1 next year, we'll be about 80% Scope 3 and only 20% Scope 1 and Scope 2. The dominant remaining issue in Scopes 1 and 2 is something that we can't solve because it would violate the laws of physics. It's ohmic dissipation in our power lines. It's I squared R loss. So to the extent that we're carrying anything that originates from a fossil fuel, we're still stuck with that. So we'll need offsets to handle that. There's a couple other things that we'll have to work on in terms of our own vehicle fleet and electrifying that. But by and large, the other dominant thing will be leaks from our gas distribution system, which we are spending $400 million a year correcting right now. So our big challenge in the future from the point of view of helping the planet will be Scope 3. And that's why you will be bored to tears at how many times I will mention energy efficiency if anybody stands still for longer than 5 minutes as an important consideration for us to apply. But no, you're spot on, Albert. You know, we've done some things that genuinely help the planet and the company, and we've done other things that are neutral to the planet but help the company. And selling an efficient gas fleet isn't going to change the fact that they will continue to operate. But you know, I'm so pleased to hear Amanda say what she did about embracing all the tools in the toolkit. And I do think carbon capture, sequestration, storage is an important consideration, especially for the U.S. The consumer dividend associated with natural gas cannot be ignored. And it is a relatively clean fuel. There's no SO2, there's no mercury, there's no fine particulate matter, but it is a carbon problem. So one should not give up on that possibly, even though we're no longer operating those plants and have no economic interest in it.
And just quickly on distributed energy, maybe Amanda, how much of this could be hosted on site, whether it's sort of on-site batteries, on-site solar, or even fuel cells and things like that? Is that a big part of your thinking? Or,
yeah,
or not?
we get this question a lot, like, oh great, can you build solar and wind at your data centers? And we do, but it's yes and, right? So for example, we have a 5 megawatt system, solar system in our Belgian data center. Our annual energy consumption in 2020 was over 15 terawatt hours, right? So we have, with limited resources, it's where you're going to have the biggest impact and we're utility scale, right? So we can do that, but really we still need to play within the markets and think on a utility scale level and everywhere that we operate. But what we can do and are doing, I think is really, data centers in particular have been thought of as we run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You want to access your cat video on YouTube morning, noon, and night, right? So our data centers are running. And we are typically, we're not very flexible in that, right? We don't have a lot of demand response capabilities. But what we're trying to do is work on that, and we're doing that in a few ways. One, we are actually in Belgium, we're piloting replacing our backup diesel generators. That's necessary in this changing climate that we have some kind of backup with batteries. And not just having them sit there as backup, but actually participate within the grid to provide grid services at the same time. Another thing that we are doing and looking at is what we call carbon-aware computing. So that means that there are certain tasks that always have to be on and they're sensitive to time. But there are other tasks that can be run at different times of the day. And how can we shift to run those tasks at our data center when the grid is the greenest, right? When the wind is blowing and the sun is shining and not running them at times of day that aren't good for the grid and we're having to rely on gas or some kind of thermal generator. So those are, I think, yes, we can do that, but really when we think about how can we have larger scale impact, these are the types of things that we're doing to create a healthy balance with the grid.
Wonderful. Well, I can see on the clock that we are out of time now, and I've actually leave this panel feeling quite the opposite of boring. Actually, I think there's so much work ahead of us to do, and I'm really glad that we have folks like you working on these really difficult problems. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.